Welcome to the Clause YouTube channel.
Together, we strive for a safer, secure, and more stable world.
Welcome to the podcast of the Center for Land Warfare Studies. This is something we are doing a lot more of, faster these days because there are so many subjects, there's so many things, it's getting very difficult to keep up. So I'll just quickly do an introduction of everybody. I think actually nobody here needs introduction. I think everybody knows who you are. But then here we go. Aparna Pandey, Senior Fellow, Head of the India Initiative at Hudson Institution. Elizabeth Treckeld, Director, South Asia Program at Stimson. Daniel Markey, Senior Fellow, Stimson Center, and a noted expert on China. And our Director General, Lieutenant General Dushan Singh, who has kindly agreed to be part of the discussion. He's got a bunch of stuff going, but I'm glad he's here. So we should start it with basically saying that there is, like I said, there's no lack of excitement in these parts, which is both good and bad. But we've had, of course, Operations Sindoor. We've had, in terms of the Indo-US connection, we've had the rather unfortunate, what shall we say, the twinning again of India and Pakistan together, which was not something we ever thought would happen, and a bunch of stuff which, in terms of the US outreach to Pakistan, which didn't go down very well. But on the other hand, there was also a lot of good stuff which got overlooked. In all the media noise, there was the US-India partnership was working. There was a quad exercise in Hawaii while all this was going on. There was a tabletop exercise on logistics, which is really a key area of India-US relations. There was also a group here on the cooperation on aircraft carriers. They were here as well. So what I often tell a bunch of people is that while there is a lot of noise on the trade front and all that is going on, the nuts and bolts of India-US cooperation continues. And if you have any doubts on that, all you have to do is to look at that February 2025 joint statement, which is pages and pages and pages long, because the partnership is so wide. So we are not going to limit ourselves just to Indo-US. That I will ask General Dushan Singh first to start off. I would also like Daniel to come in on the Chinese aspect because, like we said, the Chinese have hugely activated themselves in Afghanistan and Pakistan as well. As you can see, we will come to that in time, but I'd like Daniel to come in on that. Elizabeth, of course, you're free to go wherever you like. You have across the table knowledge. Aparna has written an very interesting piece in national interest. So we'll just go into this right now. General Dushan Singh, this is all yours.
Thanks, Dr. Kartha, and a very warm welcome to our guests from United States of America. A very good morning to you, in fact, and we are indeed very glad to have a perspective amidst a lot of information warfare, which is sometimes fake, sometimes based on perception, sometimes based on speculation, devoid of hard facts, which Dr. Tara just mentioned and highlighted that behind the curtain of this information campaign which is going around, the relations continue to remain on course. I won't say whether they are rising or they are lowering. I would say the relations are currently on course. Both the countries are trying to find some method in this madness to move forward. That is what I would like to say. But I would be failing in my duty on this particular podcast if I do not highlight the perception which is going around domestically. Because you see, ultimately what happens is that the governments get driven by domestic perceptions, and the ultimate aim is, of course, to stay in power. So if these two are the defining factors, I would say that the perception which is currently overwhelmingly being felt, at least in the Indian part of the media, and also amongst various even think tanks, etc., talking in those terms, is that probably India has been reduced to be hyphenated with Pakistan, which was always India's aim not to be hyphenated with Pakistan, because Pakistan, as many have written, is no more a threat for us but an ancillary. Our real threat emanates from our northern borders, which is a matter of concern not only for India, but it is a matter of concern for the entire world if they have to remain in a more democratized world, which is built on basic human values, etc. Anyway, but these idealistic positions are never the cornerstone of geopolitics. So geopolitics gets driven more by reality, more by national interests, sovereign interests, as we call it. And unfortunately or fortunately, here I would like to confess that the route to this was also shown by India, in the sense that we have also very, very strictly redefined our non-alignment policy into strategic autonomy policy, which is essentially taking help from wherever it is possible. So that may have shown the way for others to also follow suit. In fact, in one of the podcasts which we had with, again, we had a guest from the United States of America, and I raised this particular issue with him, and he said, "Sir, actually speaking, we are following what you are doing." So to that extent, to that extent, I would confess that yes, it's real politic which is going on. So the real politics says that we need to cooperate. The real politic also says that India is getting pushed more and more towards the Western bloc, with almost, I would say, very little options left for us to play the strategic autonomy card truly the way we would like to play it. And Op Sindur has kind of demonstrated that. First of all, we were always, banking that Russia is a very strong friend of ours, but unfortunately, Russia remained neutral. We were banking on the fact that the US support will be full throated, but unfortunately, it remained neutral. We were banking upon the fact that most of the Western world would, if not fully supporting, at least would not come in the way of the aim which India was trying to achieve, was to pull down this, to bring down this malice of terrorism uh, for good. But what has actually happened, what public sees, is that okay, Pakistan has been put on the chair of vice chair of counterterrorism, chair of sanctions with Taliban. China, Pakistan, Afghanistan are getting together. Then US showing a lot of interest in Balochistan for rare earth. I don't mind that. It is good counter to China, so we are happy, and that way we will not be very unpleasant development as far as we are concerned. But ultimately, overall, if you look at it from a perspective of Pakistan, it appears that they've got their IMF bailout, they've got the World Bank bailout. That's a huge one, $40 billion. So all these things are creating an impression in India as though India is the ultimate loser politically. I'm just saying from a perspective of the perception. How do we get over this perception is what we were looking at today. So I hope our guests from the West, or from the far away country, which is the United States of America, would like to clarify their positions on these major issues. So with that, I will stop here and request Dr. Tara to carry forward. I know I have been a little forthright in telling what I have to tell, but I suppose if I didn't tell that, then the discussion wouldn't have taken place. Over to you, Tara.
No, I've got very little to say. I mean, I'm just a little dismayed by what seems to be an apparent lack of knowledge on what India-US relations is about back in Washington. And I'm talking of the newly political. I'm not talking of the academics at all. I'm not talking of the think tankers. You had recently Commerce Secretary saying that India is going for BRICS. It wants de-dollarization. Where did that even come from? I mean, anybody who's negotiated these agreements would know that's the last thing we want, right? So there, in that, I'd like you to go first, Elizabeth, in terms of, if we are talking about a transactional relationship, which is the new the buzzword these days, how it's not a bad thing to have a transactional relationship. If you what we've got a bunch of things to offer, how do we work this out in terms of getting where we want to go in that February 2025 joint statement, which is energy, defense. I mean, there's so much in this, which is huge. But how do we get past this kind of a mentality, which, again, like I said, equates India and Pakistan, and has this thing that we are, pro China, or I don't know what. So, how do you see this going forward?
It's a lot on the table there, and good questions. General Singh, I really appreciate your comments, and I think you've teed up an interesting conversation. A lot of thoughts, but Tara, specifically on your question, I think what you started out with is an important thing for us all to bear in mind: the range and scope and breadth of the US-India partnership. And it is a time in the relationship, I think, when there has certainly been a lot of transition. There are, in some ways, reintroductions of both sides. And if you look back at the early and active diplomacy between the two sides, we've had leader level visits going both directions, and really a remarkable amount, I think, of both momentum and continuity in the relationship. Even if we change some of the monikers, the through lines remain. And that puts India in a relatively unique camp right now in terms of US foreign policy. So I think it's important for us all to keep that broader context in the picture, but also to recognize that this is a moment where the relationship is being tested in some ways. And the previous flashpoint that we could look back to, where I think, at least in my read of the situation, really galvanized an acceleration of what had been the building US-India partnership, and that was back in the Galwan crisis in 2020. Indian and US interests were, I would say, fully aligned in that context, right? In terms of US-India defense partnership, in terms of great power competition and US concerns about Chinese aggressive behavior. And that was a moment that the relationship came out of stronger. And this is a context where we have a crisis on the other border. And as we've heard, the way that the US handled that crisis was seen somewhat differently in Delhi. And I think I would point to the fact that we've seen continued senior level engagement, high level visits coming out of it. If both sides are going to be able to move forward to look towards, for example, the Quad leader summit that's happening later this year, that's, I think, a moment to build towards in the relationship. And even before then, we have indications that there are going to be a number of engagements where we will see continuity. We will see that despite this hurdle that has come up, we're not going to allow that to distract from the broader momentum of the relationship. And I think that's a really important message to send, and also something just to remind ourselves of, that yes, we perhaps have come at this and dealt with this crisis in different ways. And those are really important to talk through. I think the caution that I would give is there's the perhaps inclination to just try to sweep what happened under the carpet and move on to areas where we're more fully aligned. And while certainly there's an argument to be had that we shouldn't let it become a distraction, I think there are some important conversations around this and lessons that can be taken in. And one of those for me is just the challenge that comes up in this relationship of messaging to different audiences, and how messages that are conveyed with the Indian domestic audience in mind, for example, aren't always taken in that light, and how difficult it can be to try to disentangle and keep those messaging channels separate. In Washington, D.C., it's been a very busy week as we have dueling delegations coming to town. The dust is going to settle, and there will be a time to take stock. But I do think there are live and real conversations to be had about how we come through this situation and try to insulate this partnership from something like this happening again. And that opens up difficult questions that, I think have been somewhat sidelined for the past several years because we haven't seen a crisis of this type. But personally, I come out of this latest crisis not terribly assured that we are looking at a period of even really medium-term stability. And so if we look at some of the rhetoric coming out about this being a new normal, what does that mean? And how can the US understand the situation, understand India's interests, but also ideally help to support in some way the ensuring that if and when the next time a crisis like this comes about, that we understand each other perhaps a little bit better. Because as General Singh was alluding to, I think part of the challenge here was differing perceptions on both sides and expectations that perhaps were out of line with how things unfolded. And so it's an important time to have some of those conversations as well, as we each take lessons from this crisis.
Getting that conversation going, one way of getting going forward in terms of not allowing this to happen, and it must not happen again. I mean, if this is now a very uncertain period ahead, because I am not at all convinced that terrorism from Pakistan is going to stop, for some couple of reasons, which includes the fact that the field marshal is now in control of the Prime Minister's office, because he got the ISI chief is now the National Security Advisor. He went in as NSA and appointed him as field marshal. It's a very quiet takeover, and it was barely perceptible. That is how it is. Now, I'm also hoping that having got what he wanted, he's going to sit tight. But I don't know. But in all this, Daniel, what I'd like to come to you is that there was a lot of Chinese interest as this Operation Sindoor was unfolding, even in terms of the Twitter chatter, in terms of what they were talking about, in terms of attacks in Balochistan against CPEC assets, which went unnoticed. There were a bunch of attacks which were pretty bad in Balochistan. And thereafter, you've had the Chinese getting Pakistan and Afghanistan together after they had that meeting in the trilateral meeting. And now, of course, you have Pakistan has suddenly become a member of this Taliban Sanctions Committee. That is interesting. I mean, that is very, very interesting in terms of how that's going to play out. But that is not, in many ways, is a regular thing. I mean, it's something which comes out of General Assembly resolution. So I don't see it as a grand plan or anything of the sort, but that is where we are. So how do you see the China factor influencing India-US relations?
Well, lots of questions there as well. Let me try to make two sort of general points here that I think get at what you're asking. The first of these points would be that as I look at the recent, I don't know what we're calling it now, at least conflict between India and Pakistan, to me, China looks to have been actually the single most important external factor in that conflict. So the United States played a significant, at times, role in terms of diplomacy, but it was China that provided Pakistan with considerable military equipment, and which I believe, although we don't have firm evidence to this effect, probably played a very significant role in informing Pakistan of various things during the conflict and advising Pakistan along the way. And in some ways, China is a certain type of beneficiary from this conflict as well, not least because part of China's sort of grand strategy for South Asia is to work with Pakistan to keep India tied up and distracted from a variety of other things, but also perhaps more narrowly because China benefited from an opportunity to have a sort of a live exercise and experience with weaponry that otherwise hasn't been used in actual combat. So China benefited in a variety of ways. I think one of the critical stories looking forward, or one of the areas of research that I would like to pursue, is to better understand more of the behind the scenes action, to the extent that that's possible, to get a fuller picture of just exactly how China was or wasn't involved in this conflict. But if anybody was under any illusions that China was an increasingly important player in South Asia, I think this conflict would lay those to rest. So that's point one. Point two would be, and you asked about how China affects the U.S.-India relationship. I would say we're at a moment where in India, as far as I can tell, and I think globally, and certainly here in Washington, there are questions about the U.S.-China relationship under the Trump administration and what direction this administration actually intends to take this relationship. Until we get some serious movement on those negotiations, and until we understand where the Trump administration kind of comes down, this is Trump 2.0, this is not Trump 1.0, but where they come down on global geopolitical competition with China and how they see that playing out, I think the continued questions on those issues will play largely in Indian minds, as they do in other countries, in terms of setting expectations for what you think the United States is likely to do, and how trustworthy we will be as a strategic partner for India going forward. Obviously, a big part of what has brought the U.S. and India together is our up until this point, shared concern about China, which is not the same exact concern. That is, India is more worried about China on its borders and in its neighborhood. The United States is more worried about China as a global competitor. So they're not the same exact concerns, but they brought us together. And particularly after 2020, I'd say they really brought us together. I think right now we're at a moment where the Trump administration could go in two different directions. One would be to try to essentially find a tactical series of concessions to try to keep the U.S.-China relationship from deteriorating further over the next several years. I don't know if that'll work, but I could imagine the Trump administration at least attempting it, just as they are attempting a sort of a new outreach with Iran, for instance, which to me is a little unexpected. But they could try that with China as well. And I don't think that would be all that well received in India, but you can tell me if you agree. And then there's the alternative, which is that the United States under Trump will quickly swing back to where more or less the Biden administration and Trump 1.0 were, which was seeing China as the principal geopolitical concern in the world, and really aligning most of the rest of our strategy to deal with that, including our relationship with India. But because there's a question mark, as we discuss this today, I don't have answers, but I think that's going to frame a lot of the U.S.-India relationship going forward.
If I can just interject with a quick question there. This is, how did you see, would you say China was a factor in telling Pakistan to kind of pipe down, or was it the reverse in this particular conflict?
I think that China, look, we don't know is part of the answer, because the China-Pakistan relationship is largely opaque. And most of what's most important in that relationship takes place behind closed doors. So it's very difficult. So we'll only learn these things in bits and pieces as they may or may not come out from conversations that we would like to have, say, with the Pakistanis, that we're unlikely to hear very much from the Chinese, that we can certainly ask. So we don't have a good answer to that question. All we can say is based right now on publicly available information, which, if you read the sort of press statements, at least initially, the Chinese statements were more positive and supportive of Pakistan, but then over time shifted to a greater emphasis on restraint. And my at least initial read on this, and I think some Chinese analysts have also tried to disentangle what's going on there, and the initial read is that China had hoped, maybe incorrectly, that by being more supportive of Pakistan at the outset, they could deter India from taking a firmer approach to Pakistan. They were disappointed in that. That is not what happened. India took a significant, much more firm approach than China would have liked. And as soon as China saw that, it shifted to, publicly at least, wanting to see both sides basically back down and see the problem go away. And that is at least consistent with a long-standing Chinese preference for stability in the region. That is, they want to use Pakistan to cause India strategic troubles, but they don't want a massive hot war on their borders. And at this moment, particularly after some diplomatic breakthroughs with India over the past year, Beijing would actually like to see a more normal relationship with India emerge. And so this, from Beijing's perspective, was a kind of an unwelcome set of developments, at least in that narrow sense. And so definitely does not want to see a major war. And frankly, I don't think anyone wants to see a major war. I don't think India, Pakistan, or the United States or China, nobody wants to see that, which is the one huge positive thing we all have going for ourselves. If any of these players actually wanted to see India and Pakistan go into a major war, then we'd have a much greater problem on our hands. Right now, I think they have much more limited and manageable ends, although, as I think Elizabeth was alluding, I think we should still be concerned that despite those narrow ends, we could still find ourselves in a very dangerous circumstance. And so that's why we have to pay attention to this problem.
Thank you, Dan. That was a very good. But I just quickly, before I turn to Aparna, I just want to point out one thing. If you look at the dots which led to Sindoor, this was Pakistan literally putting a sword in your hands and saying, okay, now start a war. It was deliberate, it was step by step, and there was no way India could not have reacted the way it did. And that to me is very dismaying because they wanted you to do this. And I think there's a lot more we need to understand on the whys of that, including the Chinese factor, probably. Aparna, what I would like to ask you is when we come back to the transactional aspect of this, see, there is now, in terms of, say, there's a lot of stuff India is planning to do, including major commercial aircraft buys, including nuclear power. I think we are planning to push it up by at least 100 gigawatts. We are now at pathetic amount. It's about 2% of our total energy mix. So there is scope here for nuclear energy. One US firm has already come into giving technology transfer in terms of modular reactors. There is a market here. How is this going to work out? Which are the areas we should be working on to ensure that these actual transactions take place to make India a formidable actor in the US market? I mean, it already is. We had, I think, recently one of our major industry heads came to the US. He says, we've got 80 billion investments here. So there's a lot of money there, but it's somehow it hasn't come together. Number two, if you want to take this question, you need not, is also that there is we had a partnership in autonomous systems that was also including anti-UAVs. One of the systems is with in industries in the US, which was part of the last joint statement. Now, there is a bunch of things which India is going to need very quickly in the coming months because of obvious reasons, and including predator drones. And I'm wondering how all that is going to happen when there is no ambassador here, there is no pointsman in the South Asia in the State Department. How does this move forward?
Taraji, some part of those questions, I'm not a military person, so I think you are asking the wrong person those questions. But I'll take sort of, something, I'll answer some part of what you asked me and some part of what the general said right at the beginning. One, I do believe that all of us fall prey to what is social media and media noise. There's a presumption that what is happening today hasn't happened before. I would beg to differ. 78 years of almost India-US relationship, let's go back. I mean, there was a time when Dulles called us neutral, not non-aligned. There was a time when there was a Nixonian tilt towards Pakistan. There was a Reagan largesse towards Pakistan. That still didn't change the fundamentals of the US-India relationship. If it has survived all of that, it will survive what is here today. So let us not get swayed by transactionalism or mercurialism. But I would sort of refer to something which Dan said, and I'll draw it out a little. Sort of India has benefited for the last 35 years from, you can call it strategic altruism from the American side. That American grand strategy or American policymakers believed that India's rise per se is good for US national security interests and national economic interests. doesn't necessarily have to do with China alone. But India's rise is good. It's a democracy, it's pluralist, it's like us, its economy grows, our companies will make money, its people, they come and study here, they build build the US, and its military, it can project power in the region. All of those reasons are where the US-India relationship is today. Now, where it will go moving forward will depend on, one, where this country goes, where three of us are sitting, where the US goes in the next couple of years, whether it's going to be a primarily sort of neo-isolationism and sort of, semi-Monroe doctrine only around the US, or where there's going to be engagement with the world. Again, what the relationship between US and Russia is going to be, US and China is going to be, will have an impact on the US-India relationship. Second, I would also not sort of, worry so much about, the US-Pakistan relationship. Again, I believe we tend to sort of, hype every conversation Pakistan has with the United States into it's a reset between US-Pakistan. Resets don't happen that quickly. And I'm sure Elizabeth and Dan will agree with me that a lot of what Pakistan and US are discussing today, they've been discussing for a few years now. Counter-terrorism, economic support. It is not new. It is not something, there's nothing Pakistan can offer United States, which India will not be able to offer, or which Pakistan has the ability to offer. Coming to that, the general's question, Pakistan is a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council for 2 years. It will be on committees. So there is nothing, it's not new. Saudi Arabia has been on Human Rights Council. I mean, seriously. So Pakistan will be on these committees. It has to be, it's part of the UN Security Council membership it's going to be the chairman of the UN Security Council in July. So that's what happens. But again, the IMF bailout loan is part of something which started a year or two ago. That will continue. It doesn't have anything to do with what happened between India and Pakistan. The World Bank 10-year was announced last year. It's a 10-year, and it has to do with reconstruction and rehabilitation in Pakistan post the devastating floods. So all of these don't have to do with the India-Pakistan context. So let's try and keep them separate from the India-Pakistan and from the India-US. Let us not conflate those, because they don't have to do with the India-US strategic partnership. Those are multilateral institutions providing aid to Pakistan for certain reasons. Coming back to what you said, Taraji, the sort of, modular reactors, very good. But I'm sure all of us on the screen remember that this started in 2008. And we are 17 years later. It would be good if India's nuclear liability laws are actually changed so that these modular reactors and the companies can actually set them up and build them. If they do, that will send a message, but it will be 17 years after something which was promised. So, sort of maybe expediting on other parts will help the economic side of the relationship grow. Further, India will need to implement some regulatory reforms if it wants more American investment. It will need to undertake some of the other capital market reforms, which India has been reluctant to do. India is a big market, yes, but India needs to offer more than Vietnam does, or Philippines, or Indonesia for American companies to come. Unlike China, the US cannot ask its companies to go somewhere. They will go, like Apple, if there's a market and if they're going to make money there. And similarly, Indian companies coming into the American market will make money. But sort of, they're going to be competing with Chinese and Japanese and Korean and Taiwanese companies and European companies as well. So economics is important, but economics, you can't say because India, US are closer, American companies should go only to India. That is not how this functions. You offer more, American companies will come. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Aparna. General Dushyant Singh, would you like to come in on something at this point?
Yeah, I would. I'll make a very brief remark, and that's to do with the issues which Aparna raised about what I had said in my opening remarks. So, look, what I mentioned was that the pulse which the country is undergoing is getting dictated by these activities which are taking place, simultaneously or near simultaneously with the conflict of Sindoor. And technically, India has not kind of agreed for a ceasefire. We have only paused the ops Sindoor. So therefore, everything is being viewed from the perspective of the fact that globally certain developments are taking place which are not to the liking of. And I'll be very frank here. Look, it is very easy to be dispassionate when you are a neutral partner, when you are a neutral agent. But if you are a party to a conflict, it's very difficult to be absolutely dispassionate, right? So with that kind of a perception which is going around, the country is still trying to do something to manage the environment, but you really can't you know we know that there are, if you're a member of a UN Security Council, you will be part of various committees, you will be part of you will be heading the you will be the chair of that UN Security Council, fine. But at least resist, in the sense, at least make some statements. There was absolutely no resistance whatsoever when we raise a case of TRF. I mean, have a heart. The over a period of last 30 years, we have been giving evidence, we have been giving so many evidences to prove that Pakistan has been a source of terrorism, and you are now making him responsible to monitor terrorism. So this kind of a feeling cannot be just yanked off from the debate which is going on internally. So therefore, it's becoming very difficult for India to actually progress on the path which we are already progressing. Even a semblance of saying that, look, this should not have happened, or we are opposing this particular thing, it would have been good enough. I know no regulation can pass in the UN Security Council if any of the members disagree. That's how the TRF was taken out from the draft. So therefore, people also understand from this side that what exactly is going on. So this kind of a putting one against the other is playing out very heavily. You see the chat box, it's all I don't even have to show it to all of you. So it becomes that much difficult for the people who are in the policy or who are in the government to nuance their approach. Shashi Tharoor has been trying his level best to somehow get over this thing through some kind of a very very articulate arguments. Even he is forced to actually acknowledge this fact. We are not really upset with the other issues. We are upset with the terrorism factor. I mean, the whole idea of India was that to bring into central focus terrorism. That unfortunately is not happening. That the whole idea of opposing terrorism is not taking place. We are okay with it. You go into Balochistan, do what you want to do. Your China, Pakistan, Afghanistan is getting hand in glove, fine. That's okay with us, we'll deal with that. India is capable of dealing with that, right? But terrorism was one issue where we found that America, at least America, or for that matter West, everybody was on board. Yesterday we had a discussion with IISS, and I'm telling you, these are things which are coming out right in the open. We had a discussion on terrorism. I said, forget about other issues, forget about economy, forget about defense, trade, and other issues. They will happen because the world is becoming transactional. But on terrorism, we were very clear that at least we should get a global support, because that is one thing. I mean, 3 days later, you had an incident in Colorado. I'm telling you, terrorism has a way of coming back. I'll give you my example, personal example. And these are not coming from armchair people. These are coming from practitioners. I was a colonel, and there was a radio transmission. I used to get into the network of the terrorists. And so one of the, he used to consider me that I am also one of the floating agents going around in that part of the world. And he said, don't worry, we're going to teach XYZ a big lesson. I didn't know what he was referring to. And sure enough, I was commanding. Sure enough, when 9/11 happened in 2001, that is the time when I was commanding a battalion. And he said, we will sort out India. I said, how are you going to sort out India? He said, bhai, chinta mat karo, right? Don't worry. And 26/11 happened. What I'm trying to say is that terrorism has no friends. We have to oppose it jointly. We have to oppose it as a community, as a global community. If there are supporters of terrorism, we cannot have this real politics going, as because terrorism will come to you. Let me tell you, it has a nasty habit of biting back. And your own people have said that if you harbor snakes in your backyard, they will bite you. So that was the I should say, the emotion which was flowing around in India. And you can also see it in the chat box also. So otherwise, I am sure India and US are on the right track as far as our relations are concerned with the other issues. You talked about regulations. I had a discussion back after we had interaction with you. I had a discussion there. What happened? It was regulations are not only on your side. Regulations are on our side, your side, both sides. So regulations are by every country. So delays take place because of regulations of both the receiving country and the selling country and the buying country. So those delays are normal. We understand them. So whenever your regulations get cleared, our regulations also get cleared. Yes, India is a little more bureaucratic. It takes a little more time to clear our red tapeism in all these deals, etc. But overall, let me tell you, other things that, like, none of our agreements have actually collapsed. We are going ahead with our MRO. We are going ahead with our logistics agreement between the two countries. Nothing has stopped, as Dr. Tara mentioned. We are going ahead with the. But see the implications on Quad. Will Quad remain the way it is going to remain? So these are issues which are agitating the minds of people out here. So that was basically my intention of bringing out those issues in the beginning, that we need to smoothen the ruffled feathers of people around here. It is very important. Public opinions are important. Why do you galvanize? Why do we have elections? Why do people fund election? These are things which have to be, which are a reality. It's like the geopolitics of the world. So with that, I will stop here. I have to go for another podcast, and that is on something totally different, that we are handling China on that. So we'll talk about that in that podcast. And I once again thank you very much. And Dr. Tara, there are a lot of questions in the chat box. You may pick
Yeah.
one or two of them. You can't pick up all of them. We already have over 200 people watching till now. 500 people have actually logged on to this particular show. Just to inform you all that Claude is now coming on the center stage as far as YouTube platforms are concerned. We are getting good traction. So all of you are actually being appreciated, or the other way around, for whatever you people are speaking. And once again, thank you very much, Dr. Aparna, Elizabeth, and Daniel. I would like to continue our association in future also. Thank you, Dr. Tara, and please continue. I'll dissociate myself from this since I have to log on to the other one. Thank you.
Okay, we'll just take a couple of the questions, I think, in the chat box, and then we can wrap up. One is, why does the delays by the USA in meeting contract deadlines? I think we're referring to the G engines and other things in terms of defense procurement. There's a long list which we are waiting. Predators, oh my God, we could have done with those recently. That is one question, if anybody would like to take that on. But I just want to make one point. See, this sentimental thing which General referred to, of saying you didn't stand by us when we needed you, is very unfortunate, because actually it's a very small part of this huge relationship. What you're saying, in terms of intel cooperation, there's still a lot going on. And I think it's there is a very real concern within the US intel community as to what are the different relationships in this area. So that is an underlying constant. So if we were to need to, for example, a very, very good potential is this reciprocal defense procurement pact is very vital to what we have to do ahead. And that's good stuff for both. It's a win-win agreement. But to get there, to get the US bureaucracy and the Indian bureaucracy and the government to go full speed on the Indo-US relationship in these very, very important areas, that, like the general said, depends on, public sentiment, because we are a very, very noisy and noisy democracy. So in these questions, the what I see overall is that, of course, why the US didn't call out Pakistan, and the fact that many contracts which we've had have not been delivered. So if anyone would like to go with that.
I'll try and answer I would still maintain that the US actually supported India. The US called out the terror. And where I will come out differently is I will say that every country in this world called out and condemned those terror attacks and expressed support and sympathy for Indian victims of terrorism. The concern came when the views and the narrative and noise changed from, as long as India was targeting terror infrastructure, there was a tacit American consent. The US government and most people knew that India would strike the terror camps, and that was fine. When it changed from attacking terror attacks to a war, or attacking Pakistani military facilities, or on the Indian media when it went to things like we're going to destroy Pakistan, that is when India lost some part of the support. The support was there for Indian victims of terrorism, for India suffering, for India responding to terror attack, but not even though the Indian state was very, in its actions, it was very, measured and precise. The Indian military insisted we are only responding to what the Pakistani side is doing. But the narrative which was created was that India is actually, thinking of, escalating it. And that's where India did not get a support. So you can't get support from the world if there's going to be, a war. No country wants war. And so I would maintain that India did get support from, even China condemned the attacks. The Taliban condemned the attacks, the terror attacks inside India. The stronger statement by the Taliban than the Pakistani government, which is one level is amusing. But every country condemned them and every country supported India. So I beg to differ on that. I beg to disagree.
Aparna, the point, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I think the point was that, like you saw Vikram Misri, the foreign secretary, his statements were like so measured. I didn't like a lot of things, but this was brilliant. The way it was said, we are doing this much.
It was measured, but not the Indian media. I am sorry.
Not Indian media. I mean,
yes. But that is what
all over
the world saw. That's what the world saw, Taraji. That's what the world saw.
Yes. But on this whole, the fact that you again attacked Pakistani air bases, again, very, very precision attacks. It was designed, selected, and believe me, I've been part of the system. I know how this works, to make sure that escalation doesn't happen. So the Pakistan had at all times, and remember, those terror camps are sitting there because of the Pakistan army. So though we said we are not, we're not going to do both, the fact that terrorists are supported by these guys, everybody knows that. But to get the other, is there any point, Daniel, I want your view on how, China and the US, what do you think the likely path is going to be? Because it does seem there are a lot of questions being asked from us by US, academics and other people as to how much will India support US in a possible war with China, which is also very difficult to answer, right? But how do you see this going ahead? Because what I say, support, it can be disaggregated into a lot of fields. It's not generally necessarily our troops going out and fighting out there. There's other areas, and one of that I think is logistics. So do you see this going forward? Is there any forward movement in this area of logistics in terms of other support?
Yeah, good question. If I could, I want to answer that, but I also want to come back to, I generally agree with what Aparna was saying about, yes, the US was supportive of India, as was everybody else, with respect to terrorism, and that the shift came really with the question of heading into war. Where I might have a slight quibble would be over the question of exactly this issue of Indian restraint. So I believe that India believes that it was very restrained. I'm confident that India believes that not only was it restrained, but that Pakistan was unreasonable in the way that it responded to India, and that Pakistan over-responded and was, did things that were sort of jumping ahead on an imaginary escalatory ladder that India believes it has figured out exactly where the rungs of that ladder are and understands the rules of where Pakistan is allowed to escalate. The problem is that I think Pakistan not only may have different rules, but it may also have very strong incentives to not follow those rules. Because ultimately, Pakistan is at some level the weaker power, and its need is to show India that that it cannot be predicted as to what Pakistan will do. And because Pakistan has a very strong strategic rationale for doing that. I mean, you can believe that Pakistan is wrong in so many different ways, but if you were in Pakistan's shoes, you would understand exactly why it would choose to do this. When you look at that dynamic from the outside, from Washington's perspective, you see a less predictable, less easily restrained, and kind of plotted out set of relationships. And that worries Washington. So that's why, again, to come back to Aparna's point, which I support, that's why the United States shifts very quickly from we're very upset with the world in which India is living and it is a victim of terrorism, to we're very worried that this may get out of hand, even though India keeps telling us it won't get out of hand. It's not because we don't want it to, that we want India to be wrong, or we'd love India to stay restrained. And we also agree, I agree that your foreign secretary is quite diplomatic in his approach. None of that is wrong. It's just a matter of how do you predict an unpredictable set of events when the very players in those events, Pakistan, doesn't want to be predictable. You can't. And that's why it worries us. Anyway, so that's on that point. On what we expect from India in the event of a Taiwan crisis, very simply, I think there's a difference of views within this administration. I think there are those who are, in my view, unrealistically optimistic about what India might do in a conflict. That India, even they would go so far as to suggest that India might be willing to open a second front against China in the Himalayas in ways that would distract the Chinese, and that the more we do with India, the more likely we are to get India mobilized in a military way against China. I think that's unrealistic, but I think there are those who actually believe that. And then I think there are others who have a much narrower expectation of India. To your points that India might provide certain types of basing or overflight, or might offer logistical support, or might fill in other parts and other missions, and say the Persian Gulf or elsewhere where the United States is currently militarily engaged. India might take up some of those operations to ease the US burden at a time of war over Taiwan. Those all seem more realistic, but the problem is that when you overpromise, as some people do, about what India might do in a war, then you create false expectations for the relationship. And then if India were not to actually live up to those false expectations, then there would be recriminations and frustration and anger toward India, and overall a kind of an irritation that I think is avoidable. So I think it's a matter of calibrating our expectations appropriately for India, and then kind of continuing to work through this relationship in ways, hopefully we don't end up in a war over Taiwan, so we don't have to test this proposition. But keeping our expectations of our relationship with India realistic is a critical thing across the board.
I really like the way you put that in terms of expectations. I hope it doesn't come to that. But I absolutely and completely disagree with you on the terrorism question. I'm sorry. That if the US thinks 9/11 was an act of war, I think this Pahalgam is an act of war. If it's an act of war, then I will be prepared. That is not sorry. This is not me speaking. I think that's what the government is saying, which is it's a difficult proposition going ahead, that any other terrorist attack will be seen as an act of war, which is how it should be treated. But we'll put that aside. Elizabeth, is there any other points you'd like to make in terms of, I'm hoping a US ambassador is coming soon and the appointments will go forward in the state and in the other departments, which then should propel us. In what direction, in which particular area do you think we can move the fastest?
It's a great question. I think that probably makes 4 of us on this call who hope that that appointment moves forward quickly. We have seen that the incoming Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia, that process seems to be moving forward now. So, time will tell, but here's hoping. In terms of areas of forward movement, obviously we've been more focused on the security side today, but I think one of the interesting elements of this administration in particular is how we have kind of these dual tracked trade and tariff conversations and security and kind of the rest of the relationship. And I will tell you, I struggle to piece those two together and to figure out exactly how that interplay works. But for all of us who are more on the security side, we probably need to, go back to Economics 101 and review some of those materials. But to really zoom in on what's happening on the trade and tariff conversations, because as this administration seems to be approaching not just this relationship, but broader foreign policy, I think those elements are going to come into play in ways that perhaps might feel a little bit different from previous administrations. So that is to say, keep an eye on those conversations. There's certainly positive signals that are coming out. And my initial read of that is that can be an enabling factor. If those are able to move forward, if we're able to see progress, even if it's just kind of the first tranche of a much longer conversation, time is critical in showing progress and demonstrating that India is willing to come to the table and put some skin in the game here. And so if we can see progress there, I think in a way that is perhaps a little bit unconventional, we can open some doors in other aspects. I do want to come and reiterate the good point that was made earlier on the importance of moving forward on amendments to the liability laws, which can facilitate energy cooperation in the civilian nuclear space. It seems like there's a meeting of the minds there, and we continue to hear that coming out of statements. But I think Aparna was the one who said, all we have to do is look back to when these conversations started. So I think cautious optimism is in order there. But, I think more broadly, and perhaps this gets back to the good points that both Aparna and Dan were making, expectations are so critical in any relationship, right? But especially in this one, where I think both sides to an extent are kind of making a bet on future likely behaviors as they calibrate their actions today. And one of the patterns that I have seen very much from an American perspective, right? But in conversations with Indian colleagues, I've gotten the sense that there's a bit of hesitation to go too far in clarifying or kind of gaming out how India would or wouldn't be likely to respond in certain scenarios, in certain contingencies. And perhaps that's related to a reluctance to wanting to kind of tie India's hands, right? To be compelled then to follow through if that were to come to pass. And I think the relationship is mature enough that we can say, let's have a conversation about hypotheticals that gets a little bit further than we've been able to before, not just in terms of a Taiwan contingency, but actually bringing in other aspects of this relationship. If we are to see a future India-Pakistan crisis, for example, and have some meaningful conversations, even if it's just at the track 2 or the track 1.5 level, so we can get a better idea of where those conversations are, where the current thinking is within the system, and hopefully address and at least recognize where our expectations are misaligned. Because I think the real danger and where we can get sidetracked is if one or both sides goes in with misaligned expectations and we find out about that in the course of a crisis. And so far better, in my view, to recognize that we can sit down and have those discussions before, hopefully something never happens. But I think it'll also kind of strengthen the partnership in ways that we have to be a little bit less wary of tying our hands or constraining future behavior. So I think that's just one piece of this that could help us both learn lessons from what has just played out in terms of the India-Pakistan situation, but also looking forward in terms of our future cooperation.
I think this turned out to be an excellent conversation. So I really need to thank all of y'all. Just one quick news: India is going to the G7 meeting after saying that we would not, because it was held in Canada. So that's something which puts us back right in the picture. So there it is. I, for one, am very, very positive about the Indo-US relationship because I see it being played out here, in daily meetings and how people work together. I can see that happening here. So if you can work at the working level, if things are going well, one hopes that it will eventually pan out better. But well, who knows? Thank you all again. And I'm so glad that we had this. And all of y'all have a good day. And I'll hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Good to
much.
see you.